So welcome to this special evening that was put together by Blanca. Had been asking for quite a while that Father Elias and I would do something together, and it was just a matter of timing to put this evening together, and it just happens to fit very well. Father Elias was my pastor here in Houston, and he is now in Dallas. And so Father Elias and I had started several years ago a series called Cloud of Witnesses that most of you are familiar with. And so Blanca, just having this connection in mind, said, well, Father's going to be here doing an icon workshop, so maybe we can have just a special evening of something along those lines. And so here we are. So tonight's presentation is going to be more by way of introduction. At least my part of it is on St. John of Damascus and the veneration of icons. And so I want to begin with a very famous quote that is attributed to St. John of Damascus. The whole earth is a living icon of the face of God. And so that quote, I think, will open up the discussion this evening, the presentation, and sort of capture what we're going to cover in today's talks. So here's what we're going to do this evening. I'm going to do part one, which will be an introduction to St. John of Damascus and the contribution he made to the church with regards to the veneration of icons. And then we're going to look at the Marian icon that is most associated with St. John of Damascus, which is called the Virgin of Three Hands. Then we'll take a little break, and then in part two, Father Elias is going to give us an explanation of the various types of Marian icons, and then maybe we'll have some time, hopefully, at the end for question and answers. So we'll try to finish up somewhere around 8 o'clock this evening. But as we step into the life of St. John of Damascus, I think we need to begin with some basics about iconography. Now, this is very basic and very introductory. So what I want to begin with, before we get into St. John of Damascus, is what an icon is and what an icon is not. So let's begin by looking at what an icon is not. So I came up with just three ideas just to help us put this in some context of what an icon is not. An icon is not simply an interesting or unusual work of art, although icons are interesting and they may seem unusual if we're not accustomed to seeing them, but that's not all they are. Number two, an icon is not simply a museum piece, although we do find icons in museums, but they are not simply an antiquated art form relegated to a museum where we go to get a glimpse of the past. And number three, an icon is not simply a piece of art that we use as an adornment because it adds to the aesthetic of a room or because it matches the color scheme or something of that sort. Or it's not simply something we would use as an adornment or as decor. So what is an icon? Let's look at three things. Number one, icons are windows into heaven. They are holy images that make present the person they depict. And so they make visible the invisible. They are holy images because they are holy people painted by praying people for the distinct purpose of prayer. Icons are meant to be venerated in private prayer and public worship. And so we approach icons in silence, with dignity, and with a pure conscience. When we look at an icon of our Lord, of his mother, of the saints, we not only look at them, but they look at us. And when we look at them, it is as if we are peering into a window to heaven. And they look at us and they invite us to leave the world and to contemplate the spiritual realm. And as we do, we experience icons in the heart, not in the mind. So they become instruments of grace. Number 2, icons are theology in line and color. Sometimes they're painted on walls, sometimes they're painted on wood, other times they're constructed using mosaic tile. But in whatever form they are crafted, they are theological depictions. They tell us something. They teach us something about the faith. And number 3, icons are silent, visual sermons expressed in paint and colors rather than words. They express in images what the Gospels communicate with words. And so the language of icons is like the language of the Gospels. It is clear, it is direct, and it is uncluttered. In whichever form the faith is handed on, whether it's written or whether it's visual, it must adhere faithfully to what has already been handed down. And those of you who teach catechism, for example, you understand this, that we who teach the faith are handing on what has been handed on. Okay. So we do not reinvent the wheel when it comes to teaching the faith, and we do not reinvent the wheel when it comes to the iconographic painting of the faith. And that's why iconographers follow certain canons or certain rules when painting icons to ensure theological continuity with what has come before. That doesn't mean that iconographers are robotic when they paint icons. They can make certain adjustments based on their artistic skill, but ultimately the icon must correspond with the person or to the spiritual or theological meaning of an event. And so icons are not painted according to the artist's imagination. Christ, his mother, the saints, must look like the person depicted. Now here's an example. There are 2 icons here of St. John of Damascus. And we can see in these icons, I'm sure they were painted by 2 different iconographers at 2 different times, that there are variations in the colors. The head wrap is a different color. The detail in the head wrap is a different color. So that's an example of some of the freedom that an iconographer would have in painting an icon. But we know when we look at these 2 icons, we are looking at the same person, right? They look the same. And so while there's variation in the colors, the clothing might be different colors, the head wrap is different. What's not different is the face and the beard, right? And so we know when we look at this, and if we lined up 100 icons of St. John of Damascus, there might be 100 different variations in the colors, in the clothing, in the head wrap, and so forth, but we would know we're looking at the same person. And as far as I know, and maybe Father Elias can confirm this or not, St. John of Damascus is always depicted with a head wrap. Is that correct, Father? Yes. And so that's another thing that would make it easy to identify St. John of Damascus, in addition to his face and his beard, is his head wrap. And so if you want a little bit of homework when you go home, Google St. John of Damascus icon and just look at the dozens and dozens of icons of St. John of Damascus, and you'll see what I'm referring to. That you can tell it's the same person, but you're going to see a variety of different depictions as far as coloring and so forth. So who or what can be depicted and venerated in icons. Our Lord, angels, the saints, prophets, biblical scenes, feast days, and of course the Mother of God. And tradition believes that the first icon of the Mother of God was painted by St. Luke the Evangelist. When we venerate an icon, we are not venerating the paint or the wood. This is what St. John of Damascus says about icons and veneration. Christians do not worship the material of the icon, but they venerate the persons represented in the icon, whether it be Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the saints. And St. Basil the Great says, the honor paid to the image passes on to the prototype. In other words, the honor we pay to the image of, say, St. John of Damascus, for example, passes on to the who that we are venerating. Okay? So the honor paid to the image passes on to the prototype, to the person who is depicted. Here's an analogy. We can think about having a picture of a loved one. And let's say let's say my beloved grandmother passed away, and I have a photograph of her on the mantle. And let's just say it's in a frame. And I might take the frame down, and I might show it to someone and say, this is my grandmother. And I might kiss her photo, or I might hold it to my heart. Anybody who sees me making that gesture is not going to accuse me of kissing or showing honor to the picture frame or the glass on the frame or the paper of the photo. It is understood that I am showing honor or showing love to my grandmother. And so when we venerate icons, it's probably to us, it probably seems normal that we understand that. If we bow before an icon or kiss an icon, we're not bowing or showing honor or paying homage to the wood or the paint, but it's to the person who is depicted in the icon. But surprisingly, there was a very big controversy in the history of the church about this. So what happened in the history of the church that tried to destroy the veneration of icons? This period is referred to as iconoclasm, or the iconoclastic controversy. But it was more than just a controversy or a clash of wills. It was a heresy. And this period of iconoclasm lasted over 100 years. And it involved two periods of very intense attack against the painting and venerating of icons. The first period of attack was roughly 726 to 787, and the second period of attack, after a little bit of calm, was around 814 to 842. Now, in order to understand and to enter into a little bit of this iconoclasm and what this was, and this is all leading up to St. John of Damascus. This is just giving us some context and background. But two words will help us understand the iconoclastic controversy. The first word is iconoclast. Icon is the Greek word for image. And so an iconoclast is a breaker of images or a destroyer of images. On the other side, there were the iconodules, D-U-L-E. An iconodule is a venerator of images. And there's another word that connects with that, iconophile, P-H-I-L-E, which is a lover of images. And so when we talk about iconoclasm, we now have these two words that we use to help us situate the different sides and what was going on in the battle. When heresies erupt in the church, when they have erupted in the church, God raised up certain figures, saints, theologians, emperors, and in the case of iconoclasm, even empresses, to rightly declare and defend the true faith. And so certain key figures emerge on the iconoclasm side, and certain key figures emerge on the defense of icon side. And chief among the antagonists on the iconoclasm side during that first period was Emperor Leo III. He's also known as Emperor Leo the Isaurian. His name has become synonymous with iconoclasm. Why did he wish to destroy holy images and punish people who venerated them? What was the gist of the attack that saw so many defenders of icons tortured, imprisoned, exiled, and even murdered? Well, his reasons may have been complicated, and they may have been varied, and they may have ranged from theological reasons and or political reasons. Okay? Now, theologically speaking, the iconoclast mindset believed they had a certain interpretation of the second commandment. You shall not make for yourself an idol or a likeness of anything in the heavens. You shall not bow down before them or serve them. This was taken to mean that God, who is invisible, cannot be depicted in imagery because that would amount to idolatry. So this was the thinking that those on the iconoclast side had. And we find this, this certain understanding in Jewish thought and in Muslim thought, that to depict God or the heavenly images amounts to idolatry. And so God the Father is not depicted. Okay. Now, politically, Emperor Leo III was losing military battles, which he believed was happening because, quote, his people were worshiping idols, unquote. Okay. As opposed to the Muslim victories of a people who did not paint heavenly images. Okay. Whatever Emperor Leo's motives were, his attack on Christian iconography was brutal. Churches were stripped of icons, they were burnt, they were destroyed, and those who painted or venerated icons were exiled, imprisoned, tortured, some were even put to death. This was a very vicious attack in the church. There is a very important distinction to make, however. The attack on the veneration of icons was not simply a clash of wills. One side wanted to venerate icons and one side did not. Which side would prevail? Who was going to win? As if this was a battle of a clash of wills. Okay. This comes down to heresy. And now, where Jewish and Muslim thought and belief leaves off that to depict God in images is idolatry, Christian theology picks up. Christian iconography also does not depict God the Father in images, not because we consider it idolatry, but because we cannot depict what is invisible. John's Gospel says no one has ever seen God. And so up until the time of Christ, Christian iconography believed God could not be depicted in imagery because he was invisible. How do we depict something that is invisible? However, and this is a very big however, a monumental shift occurred when God became man in the person of Jesus Christ. And St. John of Damascus explains what this means for iconography. In former times, God, who is without form or body, could never be depicted. But now, when God is seen in the flesh, conversing with men, I make an image of the God whom I see. And St. John of Damascus writing is consistent with the letter to the Hebrews. In times past, God spoke in various and partial ways to our ancestors through the prophets. In these last days, he spoke to us through a Son who is the very imprint of his being. And this is where Christian theology parts ways with a Jewish understanding or a Muslim understanding, because God became man in the person of Jesus Christ. The invisible is now visible and can be depicted in images. You see? This is an icon, very famous. You've probably seen this. It's called 6th century Sinai of Christ the Pantocrator. Okay. Look at this icon and listen to this word from Colossians. Christ is the icon of the invisible God. Most translations will say Christ is the image of the invisible God, but icon is the Greek word for image. Christ is the image, the icon of the invisible God. And so the icon of the Son shows us God the Father. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father, Jesus tells us. And so the church's entire defense of painting and venerating icons rests on one word: the incarnation. God became man. He took on flesh. He entered into the material world. He has flesh. He has matter. And because of that, he can now be depicted in images. St. John of Damascus goes further. He says, previously God, who has neither a body nor a face, absolutely could not be represented by an image. But now that he has made himself visible in the flesh and has lived with men, I can make an image of what I have seen of God and contemplate the glory of the Lord, his face unveiled. And so if anyone asks you, where in the Bible does it mention icons? It is explicitly mentioned in Colossians. Christ is the icon of the invisible God, the image of the invisible God. And so, like St. John of Damascus, we too must defend the faith when our holy images are being attacked. So let's take a brief look at St. John of Damascus and the significant contribution he made to the faith on the veneration of icons. So he was born in Damascus, Syria. That's why we call him St. John of Damascus, or we also know him as St. John Damascene, somewhere around the year 675, more or less. He was born into a very pious Christian family, and he is referred to as the seal of the fathers, the last of the Greek fathers of the church. He is also known as the golden speaker and the harp of the Spirit. He was highly intelligent. He had a wonderful and excellent education. St. John of Damascus excelled in math, geometry, music, philosophy, theology, poetry. But he's best known for his writings on theology and his defense of the faith and his defense of the veneration of icons. He is credited with the first written refutation of Islam, and this is why he's considered the first apologist of the Christian faith to the Muslims. He's also known for his extensive and lasting contribution to the hymnography of the Byzantine liturgical tradition. The hymns that he wrote are still chanted and sung in our Byzantine liturgies today. And one of his most famous writings, and of particular interest to us today, is this work called On the Divine Images. St. John of Damascus lived under a Muslim caliphate, Muslim rule in Damascus. And his father, who was a Christian, was highly respected by the Muslim authorities, and he was appointed the magistrate of the city. And because of this, the Christians fared very well in Damascus at that time under Muslim rule. So John's father died, and John was appointed the chief counselor of the city, but his deepest desire was to become a monk. And it was during John's lifetime that this iconoclasm reared its ugly head, and especially around the area of Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire. And the chief antagonist of the attack, as I mentioned, was Emperor Leo III, whose name has become synonymous with iconoclasm. However, because John was living in Damascus at the time of iconoclasm, he was out of reach of the emperor's vitriol. But news of iconoclasm reached John in Damascus, and being a holy man with a profound love and zeal for the faith, and being a great theologian, he wrote 3 treatises entitled Against Those Who Attack the Holy Icons. And it's also known as On the Divine Images. And although John did not travel the world speaking in defense of holy icons, his writings were read all over the Greek Empire, and he had a great influence on the orthodoxy of faith in the church. And when we say orthodoxy, we mean right belief. Orthodoxy with a small o, it means right belief. And so he had a great influence in teaching on the right belief of the faith. He was the right person at the right time, chosen by God, equipped with the grace of the Holy Spirit to elucidate the true teaching of the faith. And his written defense of the veneration of icons reached all the way to the Emperor Leo III. But since John was in Damascus under Muslim rule, he was out of reach of Emperor Leo's grasp. So Emperor Leo could not put him in prison or do anything else to him because John was living, he was a subject under the Muslim Caliphate rule. But Emperor Leo didn't want to give up his fight as an iconoclast. And so he devised a wicked plot to bring harm to John and to try to stop him from defending the veneration of icons. And so he forged a letter pretending to be John, stating that he was offering whatever help the emperor needed to conquer Damascus. And so, in other words, he made it look as if John was plotting treason against the Muslim caliph. And since John's writings were so widely distributed, it was easy to get a copy of his handwriting. And so Emperor Leo forged his handwriting, forged a letter, and forged his signature, and he sent the forged letter to the Muslim caliph in Damascus. And the Muslim caliph, believing that the letter was written by John and that he was inciting treason against him, ordered that his right hand be cut off and hung in the marketplace, and that he be led through the city of Damascus in chains. And all of those things happened. And so John is now in the marketplace. His hand had been severed. His wrist was bleeding. The hand was hung in the marketplace. And he asked the Muslim caliph if he could have his hand back. And the Muslim caliph agreed to give him his severed hand. We have this depicted in an icon. So John took his severed hand home, and he spent the evening in prayer before an icon of the Mother of God that looked like this. And this particular icon is referred to as Hodegetria, which means the one who shows the way. And Father Elias can elaborate more on these different types of Marian icons. But this was the type of icon that John of Damascus prayed before with his severed hand. And he probably prayed all night. And this icon depicts John holding his severed hand, praying before the Mother of God. And he asked her if she would intercede for him and heal his hand. So he spent the whole evening in prayer, and he fell asleep before her icon. And in his sleep, he heard her voice telling him that he had been healed, and she commanded him to toil unceasingly with his restored hand. And when he woke up, he found that his hand had been reattached to his arm, and the only thing left of this horrendous thing that happened to him was that there was a red line around his wrist where his hand had been severed. And so he had a silver figurine of his hand made. I brought this little prop in just to illustrate this. He had a silver figurine of his right hand made, and he placed the figurine in front of the icon of the Mother of God in thanksgiving as a token for her healing his hand. Okay. And that is how the icon has come to be known as the Virgin of Three Hands. Now, there has been a misrepresentation in iconography of that depiction. Some iconographers have depicted the Mother of God with three hands, but she only has two hands. She has two arms and two hands. The third hand in the icon is silver, and it's the silver figurine that John of Damascus offered her as a votive offering for her intercession. Okay. Tradition believes this was the first votive offering made in thanksgiving for a favor granted. And today, the practice is widespread, right? And it's very common. We offer tokens of gratitude to our Lord, to his mother, or to a saint for prayers that are answered. The most common votive offering that we probably see in the church is lighting a candle or placing flowers before an image. But other places throughout the world, various tokens are used as an offering of thanksgiving. Some traditions use little metal tokens of a certain body part that might be healed through the intercession of the Mother of God or through a saint, for example. So when the Muslim caliph heard that John's hand had been miraculously healed, he took it as a sign of John's innocence, and he asked his forgiveness, and he wanted to restore him to his former administrative office, but John refused. He gave away his riches to the poor, and he went to Jerusalem, where he entered the monastery of St. Saba and lived the life of a holy monk. He died a peaceful death somewhere around the year 750, making him close to 100 years of age. Now, in iconography, St. John of Damascus, as I mentioned, is always depicted wearing a head wrap. And it is said that the head wrap is actually the bandage that he wore around his wrist when it was severed. About 40-something years after his death, the first female Byzantine empress, Irene, who was an iconodual, a venerator of images, convoked the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which declared that icons are to be accorded the veneration of honor. And the decisions of this council were greatly influenced by the theological contribution of St. John of Damascus and his writings in defense of holy icons. So we're going to take a break for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then Father Elias is going to come and he's going to speak to us about the various types of Marian icons, and then hopefully we'll leave some time for question and answers.
I'm going to talk a little bit about iconography. We're going to kind of go, I would say, I guess, backwards time-wise. One of the things, I think, to connect to what Leslie was talking about, one of the realities of the iconoclasm is that the iconoclasm was something that really impacted Eastern Christianity, not Western Christianity. And from the time of the iconoclasm, when many monks and nuns and theologians were escaping from Constantinople, many of them were warmly welcomed to Rome and to southern Italy. Southern Italy was at that time part of the Byzantine Empire, so to speak, and it was far enough that it was not directly impacted by the iconoclasm. And so we find from that period of the 8th, 9th century, established many churches which were part of a monastic complex. And one of the most famous ones actually is in the Roman Forum behind the Colosseum, and it is the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua. That church was just recently reopened because it was closed for some 80 years because it was not stable. And they didn't have, at the time of the excavation of the Forum and of the church, which had collapsed during an 11th century earthquake, they did not have the technology to support the walls. And so, however, in the last 80 years, there's been significant development in technology, and now the building is completely supported, and the interior walls are completely painted, floor to ceiling, and they are all of the finest quality iconography that would have decorated the churches of Constantinople. That monastery was considered, it was the Greek monastery in the city of Rome. So the iconoclasm for most Western Christians and Roman Catholics is something that is kind of foreign. So I just wanted to kind of bring it a little closer into your sphere, because the iconoclasm shares a lot with the Protestant Reformation. So what the Protestant Reformation is for Roman Catholicism, the iconoclasm is for Eastern Christianity, Catholic, and Orthodox, because it's a lengthy period that created a significant rift in the population, affected teaching, theology, took hundreds of thousands of lives, and ultimately weakened the presence of Christians in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, rendering them basically weaker to be overtaken by Islam, which is everything that did occur. So the iconoclasm for us is kind of it's a big deal. So you understand, when we talk about it with passion and pain, it is because it is something that has marked the history of the Eastern Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. But going back in time a little bit to the foundations of iconography, first thing I want to emphasize is that iconography, today when we talk about iconography, so very often people think of like Russian icons or, Holiday in Greece or something. But when we talk about icons, we are talking about a general category of Christian art. And that which is image in Christian art is common between East and West. And so any image of the Mother of God or saints or of the crucifixion before the 13th century, be it in Spain or in Constantinople, is considered an icon, because that language of art was a catechetical and didactic and theological language. So it wasn't about decor. Today, very often, when you go around to different churches, so you may find an icon in a Roman Catholic church, or if you go like to the Cathedral of Santa Fe in New Mexico, they have a whole altar screen that is covered with icons. So but icons are popular, they're decorative. Very often when I visit a church and I see an icon there and ask about it, they'll say, oh, this was from our previous pastor. He liked icons. Okay, So it's not so didactic, not catechetical, and not theological. Meanwhile, when you go to an Eastern Catholic church, specifically a Byzantine church, so you'll see icons everywhere. And it's not because that's at the whim of the priest or that the community wanted to do it. It was because they have to do it. It's part of liturgy. We interact with the iconography. It is part of how we worship. It moves us in our worship when we're reminded what we're singing, like the Holy, Holy, or we who represent the cherubim. So we are reminded by what we see that the liturgy that takes place here in this holy place is intimately connected to the heavenly liturgy. And that indeed, even though we can't see them, we see them depicted. The saints, the holy ones, the bishops, the fathers of the church, the Mother of God, and the angels are all with us in that holy moment. And so iconography is essential because it's part of how we worship, how we pray. And then we also use it to teach the faith. We use iconography to explain what is taught by the church. So the image that is depicted is not a photographic moment. It's not a moment caught in time, but rather it is a moment that now takes on a different significance because of the Holy Spirit, because of faith. And so then when we see the image of like the Nativity of Christ, we see that there is surrounded by gold. And that is a reminder that in order to understand the Nativity, it's not enough just to read the gospel. It's not enough just to imagine what it was like or, see Jesus of Nazareth or something, or see even a nativity scene. But we need to see it through the perspective of God. If we're going to understand this, then we need to connect ourselves to the mind of God. How do we do that? Through prayer, through the church, through study of the Word of God. Then we can understand. And then it means something. It's not just, the birth of a child. There are millions of people in this country who celebrate Christmas, who have nativity scenes, who are all moved by, the baby Jesus, who might make it to church that one time a year. But that's all it is for them. They have not committed themselves to seeing that perspective of God. What does this mean? We have in the hymns of the church, but even in the Christmas carols that we sing, we have incentive. What child is this? There are questions that are asked because this is just the beginning. Don't get caught up in Jesus's birthday party and the cuteness of the event. Iconography, though, the image, the holy image, the Christian understanding of the image comes out of a reality that is contrary to images. And the early church, including, the apostles, they struggled with this too. This was not something it's not that they were anti-image, they were what we call aniconic. That means they came from a culture that did not value image, because Judaism was founded on the Word, Scripture, the ability to read and understand Hebrew, even though it wasn't the language that was spoken. And so the image was not something that they missed or that they lacked. It was just something that was not present. And so they saw it in the pagan cultures, that, of course, were subject to idolatry and also political machinations, where religion, ancient Roman and Greek religion, was used as a means of dominating other peoples. One of the biggest conflicts within the Judaism of Jesus' time was the purists and those who were no longer Jews living in the Holy Land. There was a big conflict between the two, because those who lived in the Holy Land, they kept a more pure form of Judaism. They felt that they indeed followed the law fully. But those who were Jews living in Rome or Alexandria, who were speaking Greek, who were no longer connected to their own cultural background and religion, who decorated their synagogues with kind of a Greek style as opposed to the purity and austerity of the Holy Land style, they were seen as somehow losing their religious identity. All this was inherited by the first Christians, who were Jewish, who were followers of Jesus. Even those that we find in the New Testament who were not of Jewish background were living within that cultural setting. And many of them were sympathetic to Judaism, if not believers in some way. Because after all, the revelation of the incarnation, the promise of the Messiah, the prophets who spoke about the coming of the Messiah, all of that is to be found only and exclusively within Judaism and the Old Testament. So, when this question about where does Christian art come from, when this question comes up, we can say, well, it has a rather interesting beginning. A part of it we can surmise is because of the mission, when the apostles went out, when the disciples went out to cultures that were not Jewish and brought the Christian faith. They stepped into a reality that was different from their own. They came into cultures that held the image as something not only important, but essential. After all, the Greeks and the Romans, they produced statues that were unsurpassed even by Michelangelo himself. Some statues that are considered masterpieces of art because of their beauty, because of how delicate and masterfully crafted they are. There were many stories in the ancient world among the Greeks and Romans of people who fell in love with a statue, people who wanted to be married to a statue because it was so beautiful. Now, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the Romans were a little messed up, number one. Secondly, though, it tells us about the value of the image for that cultural setting and that group of people who are, we could say, Greco-Roman or Greek and Roman. Because it was the Greeks who set up these images and then backed them up with their own philosophy, that the image should be so beautiful that it would lift up the human mind to another reality, a reality that is to be found only in God. And so this ideal and prototype, all of this comes from the ancient Greeks. And then it became a part of Roman society. Now, when the disciples and apostles who are coming out of a Jewish worldview encounter these new Christians were not necessarily asking them, hey, where is your book? Read us your message. But they said, what does Jesus look like? That was very important. What does Jesus look like? And so there begins that which, this in church circles, this is sometimes a negative word, but there begins enculturation. And so Jesus then begins to appear in some of the art of the early church. And this is already about 70 years after Jesus's resurrection and ascension. So the images weren't necessarily being produced immediately. But there is also some historical, could say, precedent that is established, and it is based on two events. And this is the foundation of Christian art, Christian iconography. Firstly, among the group of the early Christian apostles and disciples, there were also people who, although they were steeped in Judaism, they belonged to the Greco-Roman world. One of these is the apostle and evangelist Luke. And Luke was very well educated. He was what we would call a Renaissance man. He studied in kind of the precursor of the university system. And as far as a university means they teach everything. And so he studied what would have been the most important aspects of Greco-Roman society, and that is logic, rhetoric, philosophy, Greek, Latin, mathematics, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, medicine, poetry, art. He would have learned all these things because that was the universal education that one would receive if one could afford it and was a part of that reality. And so Luke was educated in a way that we would say is very impressive. And that's why he is also the patron saint of doctors, artists, etc., etc., etc. A long list. So Luke, because he could create art, since that was a part of his background. So according to the tradition of the church, he was the one who painted the first image of Mary. And it's said that it is an image of mother and child. And it's not that he was painting it when Jesus was a baby, but rather this was something that came later on, possibly when Mary was being taken care of by John the Evangelist. And so there is this long-standing tradition that he painted the first image that was in the church. It was important to make that connection because anything that was done by the apostles was good. If it was done by someone else, maybe good. But ultimately, the apostles had to authenticate and verify its value in the tradition of the church. So Luke's connection, did he do it? Didn't he do it? We don't know. But in the tradition of the church, there are 72 images of Mary with the child Jesus that are attributed to St. Luke. Yeah, busy guy. Now, we know some of them are not. Like, for example, one of the ones is Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And last I saw, that icon is dated. So it actually has 1492 written on it. So, hello. But there are some icons, such as the original of this icon, Salus Populi Romani, which is the patronal icon of the city of Rome. And that is one of the ones that was called a Lucan Madonna. And if you want to have fun, just go home and Google Lucan Madonnas. You'll get the whole list. None of this was about deceiving. This was actually just connecting the tradition of the image to the apostles. And so this way it would become a part of the vernacular of the early church. It wasn't something that was pitting, Jewish Christians against Gentile Christians, but rather it became a unifying point. And the understanding also was that things had changed. That where Judaism was aniconic, meaning without icons, images, now things were different because God had revealed his plan, his Messiah, in the person of Jesus Christ, who is visible, who is describable, who can be touched, and who touches people. And so that has changed, and this was actually what laid kind of the foundation for what would become then the express teaching about images, best expressed by St. John of Damascus. But it starts there, in the church of the late first century, this conversation about the image and why God chose to reveal himself in a human form that is visible, tangible, and can be seen and heard. So that was the origin for the icons of Mary. But there's also another story. And this one we find it is related in a book that was compiled by Eusebius of Caesarea in the early 4th century that is called the Ecclesiastical History. Eusebius was a bishop in Asia Minor. He was, as far as his own faith and orthodoxy, it was rather lacking. He was a bit of an Arian. But what he did do for the church is he went and collected information. Because in the year 313, St. Constantine the Great, the emperor, had his vision, conquered the other co-emperors' forces, took over the Roman Empire, and then legalized Christianity, which had been illegal. And so Eusebius, recognizing that this was a pivotal moment, and that all these underground churches all over the Mediterranean world had a story. They had relics. They had saints. He went around and he collected these different stories and compiled them in a book. And the most important part of the book is his interview of Constantine himself. And so in that book, he writes about this interesting episode that occurred during Jesus's lifetime and that was preserved in the early Christian community of Edessa in Turkey, what is today Urfa. This ancient church received the faith from St. Jude, Thaddeus, and Bartholomew. And they came there, and there was already a Christian community there, much to their surprise. And it was because it's a small, insignificant kingdom. The ruler of their kingdom, named Abgar, was diagnosed as having some form of leprosy. And so he asked the people of his city-state, because this is the kind of the size of it, he asked if they knew about any doctor, anyone who could heal him or at least help him with his malady. And so he sent his representatives in the community, and he found a couple of Jews who were traveling and who were merchants. And they told him about this Jesus who maybe is the Messiah, who is in the Holy Land in Galilee performing miracles and teaching, and many, many people are following him. And he got the scoop. They told him everything. And so he wrote a letter to Jesus, and he had one of his emissaries take it and hand deliver it to Jesus, as Jesus was teaching and preaching and working miracles. And the letter is actually recorded in the ecclesiastical history, and it is a riot. King Abgar writes there, he said, I'm the king of this small city-state, and I'm suffering with this illness. And I found out from some of the Jewish merchants in town that you are a holy man and a healer and a teacher. I would like to invite you to my city-state and give you half of the city-state, and we can live here in peace, because I heard that the Jews in the Holy Land really don't like you. See? He heard everything. And so Jesus sends him a letter back with the emissary saying that his ministry is here. But he says to him that he will be healed. Now the story goes, according to the ecclesiastical history, that's where the story stops. Because he takes this letter, the emissary takes it back to Abgar. Abgar is miraculously healed, and Christianity begins there. Because those who have heard Jesus, especially the emissary, so he speaks about what he learned. And so, but, there are always other chapters, other stories that come from this. And so one of the stories is that the emissary, since Jesus was unwilling to come to Edessa, the emissary said, let me paint your image so that I can take it back to my master and so that he may see you with his eyes. And so the man sits down following Jesus as he's teaching and preaching and working miracles, and he's just not capturing the image well. And so Jesus, seeing this man frustrated, he takes the image into his hands. He takes the linen, the canvas that he was painting on, he takes it into his hands, presses it to his face, and his image stays on it. Okay? Now, and this is the stuff of legends. That's why it didn't appear in the original first edition of ecclesiastical history. Because one of the other issues is that uh, Bartholomew and Jude Thaddeus. Remember, how is Jude Thaddeus depicted? He's holding on his chest, he's holding the image of Christ. So in the long legendary lore of the church, Bartholomew and Jude Thaddeus are the keepers of the shroud, which eventually goes to Turin. So they took that with them. So that's where the legends got mixed up. What was the origin of that face? But the shroud, in and of itself, the Shroud of Turin today, is really the reason for images of Christ. And so it has this idea. So what happens with the shroud? Well, the shroud was folded. If you study any of the research of the last 60 years on the shroud, so they'll show you that at one time the shroud was folded. And it was folded in such a way that only the face, the head, was exposed. So people who didn't know that this was the shroud from Jesus' burial, they didn't necessarily know what the origin of this is. The city of Edessa in the early 5th century was attacked by Persians. And when the Persians were coming, the Christians of the city, and the city was completely Christian, they took their relics, and specifically the holy napkin, which is what that's called, and it's called in Greek, the image not made by human hands. They took this, they put it into the wall of the city close to the main entrance, because they figured, well, when the Persians come, they're going to try to somehow get in and then let everyone in through the main gate. And they will not realize that we hid our most valuable stuff right there, right by the main gate. They're going to go into the city and look for stuff buried and in the back walls and in all the places that are more inconvenient. And so the image and other relics, including the belt of the Mother of God, were there in that wall for 200 years. The city remained under Persian influence, and the people themselves forgot about where these holy items were. And so it happened by accident when the main gate was being restored in the early 600s. They discovered a fake wall that held behind it the image of the face of Jesus Christ, as well as the belt of the Mother of God. And these things were then taken to Constantinople. Interestingly enough, very often you'll see images of Jesus from the 500s where he's beardless. And why was this a thing? Well, the ancient Romans, they thought of beards as being dirty. That all the barbarians, the poor people, the Jews, they would all have beards. And those who were well-educated, fine Romans, they would be clean-shaven. And so Jesus, who appears at that point in a Roman toga, which he definitely never wore, so he would appear very often clean-shaven. Because the image wasn't so much for the Jewish Christians, it was much more for the Gentiles. And so all of a sudden, beginning around in that period of the early 600s, the iconography, the images of Jesus all have beards because they found the holy face. So these are the foundational experiences of Christianity and the image. A relationship that, not the easiest relationship. Many of the early fathers, even St. Basil the Great, were contrary to images. And it wasn't that they didn't like the images, or they didn't see the value of these images. Remember, all the images were done by monastics, men and women. They were controlled by the church. What was painted had to be approved. And so all of this was done very structured. But still, many of the early fathers, they were worried about idolatry. Now, in the early church, Western as well as Eastern, for example, you will not find statues. You know, lo and behold, St. Therese and Jesus on the cross, that in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, both East and West, statues were extremely rare. They were never public. They were always private. So the ones you find are usually small, compact, and they belong to some crazy empress, because they were an expression of personal faith. But the fathers had an aversion because they saw the painted image in its flatness, because it was not done as a three-dimensional image. They saw it as being less enticing to idolatry. Meanwhile, you get a statue, and at that, a pretty statue, then dress it up, and then people are going to be all over it, and they're just going to fall back into their old traditions. Because that was the nature of the early church. There were many Christians who were sincerely Christian. There were many Christians who were opportunistic. They saw the trend changing in the empire. They wanted a good government job. And they were like, we should be Christians too. But those were the types that would fall back into pagan idolatry, because they didn't have a real and a sincere faith. But the church guided this process. Remained painted image was the focus, from catacombs to churches, to basilicas and cathedrals, and also to private homes. We find beautiful images. The images, now, we see a lot of images of Mary. And so the images of Mary, there are basically three types of images or icons of Mary. Every icon that is out there of Mary falls into one of these categories. Because the image of Mary is not about Mary. Mary is essential as a part of the incarnation, but it's always about Jesus. So the relationship with Jesus. And Mary's place there is to emphasize a reality about Jesus. And what are the two realities of Jesus? Divinity, humanity. And so the two types of image of Mary, the one that points to Jesus' divinity shows him, even as a child, seated on his mother's arm, kind of aloof, detached from her. She is his throne, but he is there of his own volition. He is fully aware of being divine. Then the other one that focuses on his humanity will show him embracing his mother, the sweetly kissing, realities that are much more of the way a child acts. One of these icons is the image that I mentioned before, Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And Our Lady of Perpetual Help, the very story, so, we see the image and he's running and clinging onto his mother, and he has run so fast that one of his sandals has become loosed and is hanging. And so what's the story? Well, the story is, and it's all in the angels right next to him, Gabriel and Michael, that they thought, they were like, well, see, there's the Messiah down there playing in his backyard. let's go show him the symbols of his passion, what's going to happen. And so they went down. That's what they're carrying. They're carrying a cross, a spear, the sponge, nails. I mean, the works. So they go down to this little child, and they're like, look, this is your future. So they scared the child. And he had a human reaction because, again, he's completely human, completely divine. And so he runs to his mother in haste, jumps into her arms for protection, and there are the two angels forever in that icon. Now, these are apocryphal tales. There are, we hear every year, especially around Easter, they always seem to discover another Gnostic gospel, or, what did Judas write? Who cares? But they always discover this new gospel that has been lost for so many centuries, blah, blah, blah. And so we hear about that, and of course it's like it influences pop culture, especially that's anti-religion, and so it's a mess. And so very often we don't even know what to look at. You get an email and it says, some sort of a, did you hear about this gospel? It's like delete, delete, delete before it takes over. And it's like, so apocryphal gospels they're not really gospels, but they're early Christian literature that tells something about Jesus, Mary, that gives us, and also John the Baptist, that gives us some of the background information. They are texts which are not from the first century. They could contain an oral tradition from the first century, and indeed some do, because we can tell by the words used. But they're usually second century, if not third century. The purpose of these gospels is not, earth-shattering. They weren't made to deceive. They weren't made to exaggerate. They were meant as illustrations to educate in faith. And so the story about Jesus, who is playing in his garden and then is scared by the mean angels, that teaches the Christian who hears the story that Jesus as a child was fully human. And so these stories were done in this way, woven, maybe based on reality, but some probably not. But they were done so that the early church, in reading them, would learn about who Jesus is. And remember, this was very important because at the time when these gospels, apocryphal gospels, came into being, the church was persecuted. It was still the age of the martyrs. There were no church buildings. Christians could not gather publicly. The only place they could go publicly was to the cemetery, to the catacombs. And that's only because the ancient Romans feared ghosts. So they wouldn't touch anyone who went to the catacombs. But because of that, because of not being able to teach faith, they depended on these stories to illustrate realities. And at the same time, where do we find the first images? In the catacombs. And the images there, you won't find Jesus who looks like Jesus. He's clean shaven, dressed as a Roman. He's very often depicted holding a stick. And the stick is a wand, because it is what a magician, one who does inexplicable wonders, holds. It was the language of the Romans. The Romans understood what that was. And then the images that were in there were, well, firstly, Jesus did not look like anyone. It was a generic image, because the focus was not on making him look like he was a first century Jewish man, but it was on he was a human being. Here is God. and human being. And so he was depicted in that way. And then the things he did were about banquets and gathering together with the apostles. And that was appropriate because, after all, this was a cemetery. And so all the gathering of the church coming together is a prefiguration of the gathering of the church at the banquet in heaven. And so those symbols, they spoke to the early people, early Christians. And then the other images that literally litter the catacombs, the image of Noah in the ark, Jonah in the whale, Daniel in the lion's den, all stories of resurrection, where the person or persons should have died, they did not. And so iconography has this kind of an interesting beginning that comes out of catacombs, comes out of some of these apocryphal traditions and stories of Luke or Abgar in the Holy Napkin, which is the shroud. But there begins this image, an image that then becomes greatly explained and taught by the Holy Fathers so that it would be understood and appreciated. That God sent us this, gave us this to show us his revelation, his incarnation. Okay? How are we time-wise?
8:10.
Okay, good. I got another hour worth, so. So here I brought a number of icons. You can take a look at them. Leslie also brought a number of printed images that happened to be of my last trip. Thank you. Seriously.
Last trip where?
To Istanbul and Bulgaria. So, but the images that we see here, there are a number of antique old images, and the oldest one is this image. This is a priest's cross that comes from Syria, and it has the image of the Mother of God incised into it here in the front, with her arms wide open in the attitude of prayer. And in front of her is Jesus. This is the image of the Virgin of the Sign. So this is the third type of icon of Mary. And it is a theological image. So where you have the image which is of Jesus, for Jesus' humanity, Jesus' divinity, this is about teaching. And so the image of Mary who prays as part of the church, like we all pray. So she has her arms extended, and in her womb or in front of her is like a halo or an almond with Jesus inside it. And this image is in every Byzantine, Orthodox, and Catholic church behind the altar, because it is the image, we call it the image of the Virgin of the Sign. It's the sign of Isaiah. And secondly, it is the image of Mary who is given to the church as the new temple. Because remember that in the year 70, the temple in Jerusalem, which was an important pilgrimage place for the early church, was destroyed and desecrated by the Romans. And so just as the Jewish people lost their primary place of worship, so too did Christians. And because of that, the question was asked, what do we do now? Is there no place where God comes among the people? And that's when the fathers responded, yes, Mary, the Mother of God. Because within her womb was formed Jesus Christ, his human nature united to his divine nature, and the mystery of the incarnation begins there. And so the image is an image of that, those 9 months where Jesus is forming in the body of his mother, And the image is called wider than the heavens, platitera ton uranon in Greek. And that is because where no place could contain God, not even the heavens, within the body of Mary, God was contained as Jesus Christ. And so using Greek philosophy and logic, that makes Mary wider than the heavens in a theological sense. Obviously, it's not much of a compliment if you think about it, but it wasn't about the physical reality, it's about the spiritual. And so it's interesting, this is already depicted on this cross, and this cross is from the early 7th century. So it is before the iconoclasm, but it was an image that taught the theology of the church. Here are a number of icons. Here's actually a miniature icon that is of the same theme, the Mother of God wider than the heavens. And then there are various icons which are focused on Jesus's divinity. Specifically the icons that fall under the category of Directress of the Way, the Virgin Odigitria. And so there are a number of those here. And then there is one which is focused on the humanity, and this is actually the burial of Christ. This is what we would call the Pietà. And Mary is clutching the body of Jesus, focused on his humanity. Why? Because of death. God cannot experience death. It took his human nature to bring God into that experience of death. And so this is in a later form, but still this falls under that iconography of Mary, which directs us to Jesus's humanity, his human nature. So take a look, and if you have any questions, I'll be willing to answer them. If you have any questions for either of us, yes?
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Father. I was going to ask, you mentioned how Luke did the first depiction of our Madonna around 70 AD. Who portrayed, did the portrait of God then?
Well, God wouldn't be depicted because he has no body.
When he became flesh.
Well, it was, according to tradition, it's a Madonnan child. So he is credited with having created the first icon, which is the Directress of the Way, the Odigitria icon.
Was it painted on Mary's dining room table underneath, or is that just?
It's your fault. So, that is one of the traditions for the explanation about Our Lady of Czestochowa, the patroness of Poland, which is an icon which today we see, I think it's a 13th century painting, but originally there was an older painting, and it's one of the Lucan Madonnas. So the explanation is that this board that it's painted on was the table that Jesus, Joseph, and Mary ate at, which is, of course, completely impossible because people ate sitting on the ground. There were no tables. It would have been more convincing if they said that it was Jesus's cradle. But when this history kind of comes about, so people didn't realize some of the realities. What? Yeah, but nobody had tables. If he did that, then he was probably not a good carpenter.
So you mentioned that there's the disciples who saw Jesus, and Jesus time spending to his disciples and the people in Jerusalem, and then his resurrection. So why don't they use the actual iconic images of Jesus from that time? There were so many people who welcome on Palm Sunday. Why don't they just use those images and not make it so confusing?
Well, I mean, at that time there was no need for the
But there
image.
has to be so many artistry around there. There were so many.
Not
Great,
within,
man.
not. I mean, that was not kosher. The probably the if you were an artist in the Holy Land, you were unemployed. It's like, I mean, you could do mosaic floors,
Yeah.
but it's like you can't do no human beings. Nothing that could be, and stay away from golden calves. That's bad news. So yeah, that was, and the people who welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem, they weren't the Gentiles. Those were all Jewish people who were seeing in Jesus. I mean, the word that Jesus had raised a dead man who was already rotting in the tomb, and that was a huge deal. Not only because he was dead, but in order for Lazarus to be raised, uh, Jesus needed to actually recreate the parts of him that had decayed, which is like what Adam was created by the hand of God. So it was a huge, mind-blowing moment for the people in Jerusalem when right outside of the city, and there were thousands who had seen him. And here comes this guy who was already rotting, and he's completely restored. And so Jesus isn't just doing like Elijah raised the dead boy, but he's actually taking, raising, and recreating. So he's showing, and who creates? God, no one else. So the people were like, whoa. This is end game. If we got, this is the Messiah. So that means when we fight against the Romans, we're going to kick their butts, and and everyone that they kill, he's just going to raise them from the dead over and over and over again. So that was the aha moment. This is the Messiah. So unfortunately, it also then fizzles.
But then they had the shroud.
Well, the shroud ended up, it doesn't have much of a history right there in the Holy Land. It was collected by the apostles, and also the cloth that's mentioned in the gospel that covered the head, that was also collected, because that is, I think, in Spain. And so these artifacts were taken, but for the apostles, the early church, that they saw Jesus's image on that, it wasn't that big of a deal, because remember that they are from an aniconic culture. Image doesn't mean anything. So they took it more of a remembrance of what happened, without necessarily saying, hey, look, doesn't this look like Jesus? That for them, that wasn't a part of it. It wasn't until later on, when the image left the Holy Land, that it begins to be recorded. Stuff begins to happen, miracles. So it's that's something that I think it's very difficult for us to understand, that Judaism has no need for image. So it's like, because we look at Judaism and we're like, oh, poor you, you don't have images, how can you exist without it? And it's like, but that's because our culture is image. I mean, look at Instagram. image. Selfies, I mean, it's like, that's really a part of it. And so, but we don't understand it. And so that's why, you think, oh, there are all these great moments, but yeah, that wasn't the time for it yet. Everything happens on God's schedule, so.
When Henry VIII decided to go against the Pope and destroy the church in England, was icons part of his deal, or hadn't it actually crept into that era at that time?
Well, there were images. He was, yeah, and he went, but it was more, I think, politically motivated, because many of the monasteries had, miraculous images. People would come, hundreds of thousands of people in pilgrimage. And of course, they would buy stuff and leave money. And it rendered the church very powerful. And he who was trying to get a divorce, and fighting against the church that was so powerful, his retribution was to weaken the church. How do you do that? Hit their finances. What brings them money? Pilgrimages. Get rid of the statues and the paintings that are the holy ones.
But icons weren't part of it.
No, but I mean, icons at this point, that's already different. The Byzantine iconography is not anymore present in the West technically.
Going on that, are statues and stained glass icon, or at least fall under the same theology, the seven ecumenical council?
Stained glass is considered also image, as are, right now the Seventh Ecumenical Council also is over statuary. It's over all the other things that have developed, including mosaic and relief. So any image that would be created that would be figurative is guided by the council. The council, so Rome accepted the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which is the Second Council of Nicaea. They accepted the council, but Rome was not represented. In the other ecumenical councils, Rome always had a representative. And so Rome just kind of slid the representation to one of the Byzantine bishops who was local. And that was mainly because the Pope in Rome did not know what was going on. He was kind of like, oh, okay, the Greeks are fighting about holy pictures. It's like the Greeks being Greek. And he also didn't have any real knowledge about Islam. And Islam was already at the borders of the Byzantine Empire and taking land and people. And so he didn't understand some of those realities just yet. And so the Second Council of Nicaea was tacitly accepted, but then with time it became part of the canon when kind of the bigger picture was revealed. And then it was brought up again during the Protestant Reformation. It became a focal point of the teaching of the church. Other questions? Questions for Leslie?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.